People think the first $100,000 is just a number. It's not. It's a doorway. And the strange part is, nobody tells you when you're about to walk through it. Because the change doesn't happen at the bank. It doesn't happen in your paycheck. It doesn't happen in your neighborhood. The change happens in the most dangerous place of all, inside your head. One morning, you wake up with the same bills, the same job, the same friends, and yet something feels different. The urgency that used to control you starts to weaken. Decisions that were once made in panic go quiet. And for the first time, you realize most people don't lose money because they're stupid. They lose it because they're ruled by emotion, impatience, vanity, boredom, and a constant hunger for approval. That's when the trap shows up. The closer you get to 100K, the louder the world gets. Shiny upgrades, can't-miss investments, friends flashing lifestyle as proof of success, influencers promising shortcuts, and you can feel it, almost physically, the pull of the noise trying to drag you backward. Because the noise knows something you haven't said out loud yet. If you cross this line the right way, you stop being owned by time, and you start owning it. But there's a price, and it's not money. The price is learning to tolerate boredom, to refuse applause, to ignore stories that promise 10x returns, to build a no so solid that no headline can bend it. Because the first 100K doesn't make you rich, it makes you dangerous, with margin, with breathing room, with the power to choose. And if you mess it up now, if you lose what you've built, it's not just money that disappears. Your mind cracks, and a cracked mind starts gambling to get back, which is how people quietly vanish financially without anyone noticing. So the real question isn't, how do I reach 100K? The real question is, will you arrive as someone who deserves to keep it, or as someone who just got lucky for a moment? Because what comes after that number doesn't forgive the chaos you bring with you. Your life quietly changes after the first $100,000. Nobody warns you because the change is not in the mayor's office or the stock market. It happens inside you. One morning you wake up with the same bills, the same neighborhood, the same friends, and yet decisions you used to make in a panic feel different. You stop mistaking noise for signal. You stop chasing every bright, shiny idea that promises to shortcut the climb. That shift, small, almost invisible at first, is the payoff for habits most people never commit to. If that idea landed with you, if you want a one-page checklist that maps this path step by step, subscribe now and you'll find the link below. No spam, just a plain checklist to protect your snowball. Why is the first 100K so important? Because it's where arithmetic begins to feel like psychology. For centuries, people have explained wealth as either luck, brilliance, or opportunity.
Those certainly play a role, but ask yourself this: how many bright, lucky people still blow their savings on noise and nonsense? Plenty. The first 6 figures is the point where compounding stops being an abstract lecture and starts acting like a companion. Below that threshold, returns and time are whispering. Around 100K, the whisper becomes a low hum you can no longer ignore. You begin to see that your choices, small, boring, repeated choices, are not trivia. They are the engine. Let me put it another way. Think of money as a snowball at the top of a hill. At first, it is nothing but cold, wet work in your hands. You scrape snow, you shape it, and the ball is modest. Roll it a little, and it gains a sliver of mass. Roll it consistently, and at some point the weight and momentum make the hill do the work for you. You still push the ball up the first bit, but the slope and persistence turned effort into acceleration. That moment, when the ball starts to roll on its own, is roughly what that first 100K buys. It doesn't magic you into a genius investor. It buys you 2 things: margin and time. Margin against catastrophe, and time to let sensible choices compound. Most people fail before they get there for reasons you will recognize if you are honest. I will group them, name them, and give you a clear countermeasure for each one. This is not moralizing, it's diagnosis. If you can fix the behavior, the money usually follows. Reason 1, impatience. The world today is optimized for instant gratification. We live in a culture that rewards speed and novelty. The internet teaches us to expect immediate feedback, But savings and investing are not instant feedback machines. If your psychological thermostat is set to now, you will always be seduced into spending, rebalancing for novelty, and abandoning plans because some new Instagram narrative promises a faster lift. The countermeasure is structural. Automate. Pay yourself first. If money never hits your spending account because it is swept into savings or investments on the day you get paid, your impulse never gets a vote. Consistency here is boring, but boring compounds. Reason 2. Lifestyle creep. When your income grows, temptation grows faster. A raise becomes a new standard, not a surplus. Friends upgrade their cars, coworkers travel to places you don't, and suddenly your expenses feel like virtues, proof you've made it. This is where people confuse consumption for success. The remedy is a principle I prefer to a budget. Keep your baseline spending modest while raising your savings rate as income rises. Treat increases in pay as a test of character. If you can't pass the low-cost test while your income goes up, you will never pass the high-stakes tests. Reason 3. Boredom with the boring. The investing landscape is littered with people who traded their way into poor outcomes because the passive route is boring. They chase complexity, fees, and novelty to fill an emotional gap.
Buying stocks becomes less about ownership of businesses and more about entertainment. The antidote? Reframe boredom as a signal, not an opportunity. If something feels boring, embrace it as stability. Make a rule. Allocate a fixed portion of your portfolio to stable, simple holdings and another, much smaller portion to exploration. Keep both in proportion to your temperament. Reason 4. Ignorance disguised as confidence. There is a peculiar human talent for talking confidently about things we do not understand. People will explain exotic financial products, esoteric strategies, or meme-fueled trends with the same tone they use to order coffee. Confidence is not competence. The protective device here is the circle of competence. Know what you understand and what you don't. For topics outside the circle, either study until the fog clears or avoid. Simple, defensible understanding beats clever ignorance every time. Reason 5. The need for approval. Nothing destroys a financial plan faster than doing things to impress others. The neighbor's new car is a public proof of status. Your retirement plan is private and invisible, so we bend our behavior towards applause and away from prudence. The cure is ugly but effective. Make saving private and non-performative. Don't post every purchase. Make discipline a habit you rarely talk about. Humility is a financial advantage. Reason 6. Outsourcing judgment. Handing your financial life to someone else is easy. Taking it back requires work. Many people outsource not only execution but thinking, following financial headlines, buy lists, or a stream of advisors without testing them. The remedy is to be skeptical and to demand simplicity. When an advisor or idea cannot be explained in one paragraph you can understand, treat it with suspicion. Reason 7. Noise. Markets have more noise than signal. Daily fluctuations, pundit opinions, sensational headlines, they're all noise designed to sell attention. If your behavior is driven by noise, you will buy high and sell low. The defense is to build filters, a checklist for reacting to market events, thresholds for action, and a cooling-off period before any major change. Noise should trigger processes, not panic. Reason 7. Self-deception. This is the softest and most dangerous failure mode. People like to believe myths about themselves, that they are more disciplined than they are, that they understand more than they do, that one trade will make up for a year of bad decisions. Self-deception is an insidious amplifier of every other mistake. The cure is external accountability. Share your plan with someone who will call out the obvious errors and will not applaud them. Create friction against self-deception. Small daily checks that expose truth. List the reasons and you may notice a theme. These are mostly psychological errors, not numerical ones. Money math is simple. Human behavior is complex.
That's why the first 100K is primarily a test of who you become under boredom, temptation, and delayed gratification. When you prove to yourself you can do the small things repeatedly, you change. Once you prove it, the money begins to follow more predictably. To make this concrete, let's walk through one simple numerical illustration. Call it less prophecy than an illustration, showing how different saving rates change outcomes, holding other variables constant. Assume for the sake of example an average annual return of 8%. Not a promise, just a round number for clarity, and that contributions are made monthly. Consider two people with the same take-home pay of $40,000 a year. Person A saves 10% of income. Person B saves 25%. Over 10 years, with compounding at our assumed rate, person A's balance will be materially lower than person B's. The exact numbers are less important than the message. Modest additional discipline, repeated, produces a disproportionate difference. Put another way, small percentage changes in saving rate produce large absolute differences over time because you're not just adding, you're buying a larger base on which compounding works. This is why economists and long-term investors love the phrase, save more than you spend. It's not morally superior, it's arithmetically superior. If you want to see how this plays out visually, imagine two snowballs rolled over the same slope. One collects twice as much snow on each pass because it started each roll slightly larger. Over a few dozen rolls, the gap is enormous. Now, none of this is to say income doesn't matter. The richer you get, the easier some things become. More optionality, more margin for error, but money amplifies character. If you reach 100K by luck but revert to bad habits, you won't keep it. If you reach 100K by habit and discipline, the figure is a validation of identity. You are the kind of person who can save, who can delay gratification, who can avoid noisy distractions. That identity matters more than the number printed in your account. In the long run, the person becomes the portfolio. Let me pull a page from history to illustrate the power of patient thinking. Look at companies that grew into durable businesses. That growth rarely occurred because management chased every fad. It came from compounding advantages, repetition of sound policies, and avoidance of stupid, ego-driven bets. When Warren and I looked at businesses, what mattered was how the company behaved over cycles, not how it performed in the headlines this week. That same attitude applies to personal finance. You make decisions you can repeat for decades, and you win. You make flashy decisions you cannot repeat, and you're gambling. This is also why protecting early capital is so important. Early losses are expensive in two ways. They shrink your base, and they damage your psychology. Imagine two savers each with $50,000.
One protects it diligently. The other treats it like a test fund for high-risk bets. If the second person loses 30% on a speculative idea, they now have $35,000. More pressure to chase quick gains, more temptation to take outsized risk to get back to the original level. That desperation is a behavior risk, not a market risk. The iron lesson is this. It's not how fast you get to 100K, it's how you play the intervals before you get there. Protecting what you have is a strategy that compounds because it preserves optionality and reduces the need for risky behavior later. You will hear a lot about getting rich quick narratives. Ignore them. They are noise, often cleverly packaged. There is no moral righteousness to being slow and steady, only arithmetic. But here's the paradox. Arithmetic hides behind boredom. If you can't tolerate the boring, you will be lured by narratives that promise speed. Those narratives work as long as they find new victims. The first rule is simple. Avoid stupidity. The second rule is consistency. Avoiding stupidity is not glamorous. It requires saying no to overcomplicated products, costly churn, and bets you cannot explain in plain language. Now let me be blunt. Many people overestimate their self-control. They believe they will behave well once there is more money because they imagine a rational self. But money reveals character. It doesn't create it. The first 100K is less about the number and more about proving to yourself that you can be the kind of person who sticks to plans, who tolerates delayed gratification, who avoids performative spending. If you stumble before that test, money magnifies the error. If you pass it, money validates identity. So far, we have diagnosed common traps, provided remedies at a high level, and seen why the 100K threshold matters as a psychological inflection point. But the story is not complete. There are practical guards and specific routines that make the difference between someone who flirts with 100K and someone who crosses it and uses it as a foundation. These are less flashy than the internet's myths, but they are the real tools. Automated savings, clear rules for portfolio allocation, a simple process for evaluating new ideas, and an insistence on staying inside your circle of competence. One useful framework here is what I call a decision checklist. For any financial decision, buying a new gadget, reallocating a portion of your investments, or chasing a market trend, run it through the checklist. Does this decision increase my long-term optionality? Do I understand the mechanics? Can I explain it in a sentence? Does it have a margin that tolerates errors in my judgment? If you cannot answer these tightly, default to inaction. Remember, most profit in life comes not from brilliance, but from avoiding dumb mistakes. Let me give you a short, sharp example to show how small rules matter. Two neighbors earn similar incomes.
Neighbor A spends to impress, reallocates frequently, and reacts to headlines. Neighbor B automates a 20% savings plan, keeps a simple, diversified portfolio, and works to expand her circle of competence slowly, by reading, not by trading. 10 years later, the portfolios tell the story. The difference is not an exotic investment, it's the discipline of repeated modest actions. People admire brilliance, but they should emulate consistency. At this point, you may be wondering about the role of education. Yes, learn. Read annual reports. Understand basic economics. But beware of learning paralysis, the endless quest for more information that becomes an excuse for inaction. The right balance is to learn enough to decide, and then decide often enough to learn from experience. Small, deliberate mistakes are an excellent teacher when you make them within a protected frame that preserves your core capital. I want to pause on one topic that tends to be misunderstood: overconfidence. It is not a rare affliction. It is everywhere. We overestimate our ability to pick winners, to time markets, and to predict trends. Overconfidence leads to leverage, and leverage is an accelerator of stupidity. Early on, avoid leverage. Your first 100K should be built on a foundation of safety and repeated good choices, not on borrowed bets. Leverage magnifies errors and makes the snowball fragile. You should also guard against envy. Envy is corrosive because it distorts goals. The neighbor's success is a data point, not a mandate. If you orient your behavior to match others, you will always be behind the presenter's edited highlight reel. Convert envy into curiosity instead. Ask what trade-offs the other person made and whether those trade-offs fit your life. Most of the time, they don't. There's another subtle prize you win after the first 100K: judgment. Small account balances allow for sloppiness because the stakes are low. Once you have a meaningful sum, you begin to get better at judgment because mistakes hurt more. This is educational. The pain of a mistake forces better habits, but better habits are earned, not conferred. The crucial point is that 100K is often where trial and error turns into disciplined expertise because you care enough to care. At a practical level, some people will try to shortcut these lessons with novelty bets, speculative trends, leverage, or emotional trades, and they'll sometimes get lucky. Luck can make a story, but it doesn't make a habit. Baseline your thinking on what you can repeat. If you cannot scale your behavior into habit, luck will be fleeting. We have covered a lot: the psychological reasons people fail, the math metaphor of the snowball, the need for protective rules, and the character tests that money imposes. We've pointed out the main defensive tools: automation, circle of competence, avoidance of leverage, and a simple decision checklist. But the narrative is not complete.
There are behaviors to cultivate that turn the first 100K into a springboard rather than a ceiling. There are also precise numeric demonstrations of how saving rates alter outcomes that deserve a careful walkthrough. There is a set of stories from business history, companies that exhibited the same boring, relentless consistency we are recommending, that illustrate why patience beats cleverness over decades. And finally, there are the tender psychological changes that money enables: the capacity to say no, the relief from desperation, and the shift in your social filters. That is where we turn next, into the arithmetic and the case studies that make the abstract points undeniable. We will walk through side-by-side numbers so you can see, not imagine, how discipline translates into a larger balance. We will look briefly at companies whose behaviors mirror the personal habits I am urging you to adopt, and we will extract the usable principles. Then we will build a compact, usable checklist that you can implement this week. No philosophy, no lectures, just concrete habits. Before we run those numbers, one last admission: transformation is never purely rational. Habits are formed by emotion, by small wins that reinforce identity. That first 100K does not merely buy a number, it buys proof that you can be reliable. Once you start to see accumulating returns, your tolerance for nonsense declines. You start to ask better questions. You care less about debt-to-impress ratios and more about real optionality. You begin to enjoy the compounding of dignity as much as the compounding of capital. So next, we'll get practical. I will show you a pair of realistic saving paths with clear assumptions so you can see how different choices map into different outcomes. We'll examine how the snowball accelerates, and we'll pull lessons from corporate history to help you translate the math into daily behavior. Then we will make a plan you can follow without drama. The path is boring, but the result is not. The first 100K is the valley where the real change happens, inside your habits and your judgment. What follows is how to arrive there and what to do when you do. Here's the arithmetic so the point stops sounding like a slogan and starts feeling like cold, useful reality.
Take the two savers I mentioned, same take-home pay, $40,000 a year. Person A channels 10% of income into savings, $4,000 a year, roughly $333 a month. Person B channels 25%, $10,000 a year, roughly $833 a month. For clarity, let's assume a reasonable long-term return of about 8% annually and compound monthly. I am not promising 8% for any given period. It is a round number to make the math easy to follow. After 10 years of steady monthly contributions, Person A ends up with roughly $61,000. Person B ends up with roughly $152,000.
Same income, same time, different habit. The saver who gave up an extra 15 percentage points of spending built more than 2.5 times the balance. Stretch the horizon to 20 years, keeping the same behavior and assumptions, and those two balances separate even further. Person A's account crosses into the high 100s, while Person B approaches $500,000. The lesson is not mystical. The lesson is that small increases in the savings rate buy a larger base, and a larger base turns the arithmetic of compounding into a force that works for you. Now add one more variable, the buffer. Say somebody arrives at $100,000. That sum is not life-changing in the way flashing social media balances look, but it is life-changing in how it changes options. It reduces the pressure that pushes people toward risky behavior. When you have a buffer, you can let mistakes be lessons instead of calamities. The difference between being able to sleep after a market drop and waking up in a cold panic is worth tens of thousands in decision quality over a lifetime. That is one of the invisible payoffs of the first 6 figures. You increase the probability you will act like a patient person the next day. Because humans are not spreadsheets, numbers alone don't make decisions. They make identity. The arithmetic converts into psychology when you keep the habit long enough for small wins to reinforce the behavior. That is why I keep returning to the adjective boring. Boring behavior repeated becomes identity. Identity changes behavior. Behavior creates results. If you want to accelerate that spiral, structure your life so the boring parts have to happen. Automate. Make saving the default. Make spending a deliberate action you have to choose, not a reflex. Let's take a practical real-world slice, protecting early capital. Imagine 2 people, both fortunate enough to reach $50,000. One treats that sum like something to defend, low-cost, diversified positions, an emergency cushion, no leverage. The other treats it like a laboratory, high-conviction bets, margin, all the things sound in a victory parade. If the second person loses 30% in a bet, their $50,000 falls to $35,000. To get back to $50,000 requires roughly a 43% gain on the reduced base. That is not just math, it is a behavioral cost. The loss induces fatigue, shame, and often the temptation to take more risk, exactly the wrong medicine for recovering losses. The first person who protects their capital rarely has to chase returns. They can compound steadily. That psychological advantage compounds as the account grows. Historical examples give texture to the argument without acting as a guarantee. Consider durable businesses that rewarded patient owners, not flashy traders.
Companies that build compounding advantages did not do so by chasing headlines. They did it through repeated, simple choices, maintaining pricing power, reinvesting profits sensibly, and avoiding leverage that would make them fragile in a downturn. When investors like Warren and I studied businesses, we looked for understandable economics and a margin for error, not for clever accounting or trend chasing. That same posture applies to personal portfolios. If you own businesses or stocks you can explain in plain language and that you could hold through a loss, you are in much better shape than the person who owns a jumble of what sounded interesting last week. I want to be careful about one temptation, the desire to turn this into an intellectual exercise about finding the one right investment. That is a seductive trap. A single brilliant investment can change your account balance. It does not necessarily change your character. Luck can get you wealth, but it can also make you fragile. The consistent path is to build habits that survive cycles and to avoid behavior that is not repeatable. If you only win when luck aligns with your impulses, you haven't built a life that can compound reliably. So how do you make these habits operational? Start with a decision checklist you actually use. It needn't be complicated. For any financial decision, answer 4 plain questions. Will this increase my long-term optionality or merely my present status? Do I understand the mechanics of this choice well enough to explain it in one sentence? If I am wrong, what is the worst reasonable outcome, and is that outcome tolerable? Am I doing this because of an internal plan or because of external applause? If you cannot answer those questions quickly and honestly, default to doing nothing. The default is powerful. Most people simply never give themselves one. Once you make the checklist a habit, add mechanical guards.
Set up automatic transfers on payday that route money to savings and investments before you can spend it. Keep 2 accounts for a while, a spend account and a save account. Make the save account the boring one that you rarely look at. That simple separation reduces friction and censors impulse. Over time, you can make rules for allocation. Some fixed percentage to a safety bucket, some to long-term diversified holdings, a small discretionary slice for learning or exploration. The specifics should suit temperament, but the architecture of regularity should not be negotiable. Parallel to mechanics is the concept of circle of competence. Know the businesses you can explain. If you buy a company or a product you do not understand, treat the purchase as a high-probability mistake. The confidence with which people describe unknown things is often inversely proportional to the risks those things carry. Read, ask simple questions, reduce complexity, and if a product cannot be explained in basic terms, walk away.
Expanding your circle is laudable, but do it by study and small experiments that preserve capital, rather than by aggressive betting to learn fast. I want to tell a very short, fictionalized illustration because the mind remembers faces. 2 neighbors, call them Alex and Morgan. Both start in their late 20s with modest jobs. Alex is impulsive and loves novelty. Morgan is methodical and slightly boring. Alex reads a newsletter that promises 10x returns and starts trading active bets with leverage. Morgan sets up an automatic contribution to a simple, diversified portfolio and uses what remains for small, accountable pleasures. 5 years in, Alex has had a thrill and a loss, a volatile curve of gains and negative returns that ends close to where it started. Fatigue sets in. Morgan's balance has been steady and quietly larger. 10 years in, Morgan sits with a balance that buys options. Time to take a lower-pressure job, to start a side project without needing immediate income, to weather an emergency. Alex has the stories and a smaller financial cushion. Which life would you rather lead? That is the intangible edge the $100,000 milestone buys: options and the ability to make choices uncoerced by desperation. A critical psychological hazard to name is the approval dynamic. Humans are social animals. We love accolades, but public displays are a tax on future options. If you spend to signal status now, you borrow from your future freedom. The antidote is not austere denial of pleasure, it is deliberate privacy. Make discipline private. Let your choices be for your future self, not for the applause of strangers. That reduces the temptation to perform and increases the likelihood that your habits will survive social friction. You will resist this by telling yourself the narrative that you are different, that your lack of immediate spending is deprivation. That is where the humility check comes in. Humility is not a moral posture, it's an investment strategy. It is the willingness to accept that others may know things you don't, and the courage to prioritize long-term competence over short-term applause. Humility is practical, and it is a muscle that improves with use. Let's return to the numerical world for one more thought experiment that exposes the fragility of luck. Suppose 2 individuals achieve $100,000 each. One arrived there through repeated savings and low-cost investing. The other had a brief run of luck, a windfall, a hot tip, an inheritance. Which profile is more likely to hold the money 5 years later? The repeated saver has earned a pattern of behavior. The lucky one has not. If the lucky person lacks the underlying habits, the first setback can erode the psychological foundations that allowed the gain. That is why we emphasize not merely the milestone, but the manner of arrival. The milestone proves nothing unless the habits behind it are real.
We must talk about overconfidence and leverage because they are accelerants of ruin disguised as shortcuts to success. Overconfidence is a natural result of early success. Humans notice success and infer skill. Then they lever up. Leverage transforms ordinary mistakes into catastrophes. Early on, avoid borrowing to invest. Don't use margin. Don't take loans to chase the next shiny thing. Your first 100K is best grown through unlevered, repeatable decisions. If you use leverage to accelerate growth, you are substituting the external math of finance for the internal math of character, and character tends to win. Envy deserves its own paragraph because it corrodes not just money, but relationships and judgment. People compare their backstage to someone else's highlight reel. You will be offered monthly glimpses of other people's best moments and almost never of their compromises. Anchor yourself to your goals. Ask, what trade-offs am I willing to make? If someone's lifestyle requires bets you are not comfortable with, their life is not a template for you. Convert envy into curiosity. Study the choices of others to learn the trade-offs instead of copying surface behaviors. There is also a practical rhythm to maintain when you reach the first 100K. First, protect a cash cushion sufficient for the kind of job you have and the risks in your life. For many, that means 3 to 6 months of living expenses. For others, more. Second, keep your core allocations simple. A diversified stock allocation, a bond or cash portion that reflects your time horizon, and a small experimental pocket for educated bets. Third, revisit your circle of competence at regular intervals. Read a few annual reports, ask simple questions, and increase positions only when you can justify them in plain language. A key structural defense is to create decision rules for market noise. News cycles will try to make you emotional. When a news story emerges that tempts you to act, use a 3-step filter. Pause, ask whether the new information changes your long-term thesis in a material way, and then require independent corroboration before acting. If your move is purely reactionary, it probably isn't necessary. Design a cooling-off period, 24 to 72 hours for most non-urgent choices, so emotion has to earn a place in your behavior. We should also talk about learning by small, deliberate experiments. If you want to expand your circle of competence, say to understand a new asset class, do it with a small position that you can afford to lose as a tuition payment. Make the experiment structured. Set a maximum loss you will accept, set a time limit to evaluate what you learned, and extract one lesson from each failure. This converts mistakes into curriculum rather than into trauma. At this stage, it helps to step back and recognize the meta rule. The person who can reach $100,000 reliably can probably reach $1 million if they remain that person.
The math is not the only thing that scales. Identity scales too. That is the encouraging paradox. If you have proven you can be someone who saves, who resists noise, who protects capital, then multiplying your balance is an extension of the same behaviors scaled up, not an entirely different skill set. However, if someone reaches 100K by accident and does not change behavior, the path to $1 million is perilous because the habits have not been forged. Now, as promised, a compact checklist to implement immediately. It is intentionally short so you can memorize it and use it. First, automate savings. Pay yourself first. Second, keep an accessible emergency buffer that prevents panic-induced mistakes. Third, invest within your circle of competence. If you do not understand it, do not buy it. Fourth, protect capital. Avoid leverage and speculative bets that threaten your base. Fifth, use a simple, repeatable allocation and rebalancing rule rather than trying to time markets. Sixth, make saving private and non-performative to resist the need for applause. Seventh, create a cooling-off process for reactive decisions. Eighth, document your rationale for any non-trivial investment and set an exit rule. Ninth, expand your education deliberately with small, teacherless experiments that have clear stop losses. 10th, periodically review your habits, not just your balance. The habit review matters more than the market review. There are a few practical nuances worth clarifying. When I say invest in what you understand, I don't mean hold everything you deem familiar without risk control. Understanding is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Also, the emergency buffer is not a license to sit with cash forever. It is a psychological and financial tool to avoid forced selling. Regarding allocation, keep fees low. Fees compound against you just like returns compound for you. Over decades, a few percentage points in fees can make a difference larger than the difference between two investment styles. A common question is, when should you start moving beyond the basic template? The answer is simple: when you have proven repeatability and preserved capital through at least one meaningful cycle. That means you have practiced the boring routines through a period that included real variance, market noise, career hiccups, or family expenses, and you still followed the plan. Once repeatability is demonstrated and capital is intact, you can consider more concentrated bets for a small portion of the portfolio, but only after sober analysis and with a margin for error. Remember the psychological rewards. After hitting the first 100K, many people report subtle but important changes: less urgency to chase every opportunity, a better ability to say no, clearer judgment in relationships, and improved career leverage because they can choose better opportunities rather than being pushed by immediate financial needs.
Those changes are real and compound in their own way because they affect every decision you make. Do not let the modesty of 100K fool you. It is not a finish line, it is a proving ground. It is the moment when boring arithmetic converts into felt capability. The milestone forces questions. Are you reliable? Can you delay gratification? Will you protect what you have? The answers to those questions determine whether the snowball becomes a mountain.
A final encouragement. The path is not glamorous, and that is why most people never pursue it with the necessary consistency. The internet rewards spectacle and punishes steady work with low clicks. That disconnect is precisely your advantage. If you embrace the boring, you will play against a field optimized for noise. Little actions that are trivial in isolation, an automatic transfer, a refusal to trade on a headline, a private habit of saving rather than showing, compound because no one else values them enough to repeat them. You gain an edge precisely because it is unseen and ordinary. So what do you do this week? Start with 3 concrete steps. Set up an automatic transfer that saves at least 10% of your income, arrange a separate account for that transfer that you rarely touch, and write down a 1-sentence investment rule you can follow for the next year. No trading, no leverage, just a repeatable allocation. Do those 3 things and you will be practicing the habit that creates the possibility of the first 100K. Do them for long enough, and you will notice the quality of your decisions improve. If you have already reached the first 100K, use this moment as a checkpoint, not a trophy. Reassess the rules that got you here. Protect the capital. Increase the discipline. Make your behaviors public only when they need to be audited, not applauded. If you are a little shy about the word discipline, call it routine or sensible friction. The label matters less than the deed. Let me close with one blunt point that is also an encouragement. Avoid stupidity. The single most effective strategy in investing and in life is to avoid catastrophic errors. You don't need to be brilliant. You need to be boringly competent and vigilant against obvious mistakes. Combine that avoidance of stupidity with relentless, boring consistency, and you create a life that compounds in more ways than one. The hard work of becoming the person who can quietly build wealth is the work worth doing. If you do that, the money will be an honest reflection of your habits, and once you have proven to yourself that you can sustain the routine, the path to significantly greater sums becomes much clearer. If this resonated, if you want a short, printable checklist and a habit tracker that puts these ideas into a week-by-week plan, I put together a compact worksheet that lays out the mechanical steps we discussed.
It includes a simple savings funnel, a 1-paragraph decision checklist template, and a habit log to track automatic transfers and reviewing your circle of competence. If you want that, subscribe and you'll find the link in the description. Share this message with someone who keeps chasing headlines instead of building a buffer. It might be the most useful gift they receive. Protect the snowball. Avoid the mistakes that compound into catastrophe. Keep doing the boring things, and the world will quietly reward you.